It was a regular Wednesday afternoon, like any other. My name is Jessica, and I have a story to tell. A story that might shock some of you, perhaps make others question my decisions, but it's one I've kept hidden for so long. I've finally decided it's time to come clean. My story isn't some wild tale about outrageous behavior or explicit scandal. It's about love, loneliness, and how a simple connection went terribly wrong. My husband Richard and I had been married for almost a decade. We met when we were both fresh out of college. He was ambitious, charming, and the kind of man who could walk into any room and have everyone's attention in an instant. I fell hard for him, and those early days were like a scene out of a romantic movie. But like many movies, our honeymoon phase gradually ended. Richard's career took off quickly. He was in high demand, and while I was proud of him, his long business trips and countless meetings began to chip away at our relationship. He was constantly traveling for work, networking events, conferences, client meetings. For a while, I did my best to stay supportive, always reassuring myself that he was doing all of this for our future. We would share late-night phone calls whenever he was out of town, but they started feeling mechanical, just polite check-ins with no real substance. The days at home grew longer. I had quit my job a few years into our marriage to support his career, managing the household and planning for the future we had imagined together. But it seemed the future we talked about was always postponed by another trip, another meeting, another opportunity that Richard couldn't pass up. The loneliness I felt deepened. I found myself spending days without meaningful human contact. We lived on a farm outside the city, a peaceful retreat we had picked to escape the hustle and bustle. Our property was expansive, and one of the first things we did was get animals, chickens, goats, and my personal favorite, our horse, Midnight. Midnight was an elegant black stallion with a gentle spirit. He was a gift from Richard for our 5th wedding anniversary, a grand gesture to make up for his absence. Midnight and I grew close. I would spend hours in the stable brushing him, talking to him, taking care of him. It sounds cliché, but animals can sense emotions better than most people. Midnight was no exception. His dark eyes seemed to understand my pain. He was patient, gentle, and most importantly, he was there. Unlike Richard, Midnight was never too busy, never distracted. It became part of my routine, making a morning cup of coffee, staring at the empty chair where Richard would have sat, and then wandering to the stable. I would confide in Midnight, sometimes crying into his thick mane. I shared my fears, frustrations, even my unfulfilled dreams. Midnight became my emotional support, filling the void that had grown so wide in my marriage. One summer evening, things began to change. Richard was away, again, and I was feeling more isolated than usual. I wandered out to Midnight's stable, hoping to find some solace. As I brushed his shiny black coat, I started speaking to him aloud, pouring my heart out about my frustration and loneliness. The words tumbled out, some directed at Richard, some at the emptiness I felt. Midnight stood there, listening as usual. But this time, it felt different. My heart raced, and I felt a warmth I couldn't quite explain. I caught myself, shook my head, and muttered, "Jessica, what are you doing?" Midnight was a horse. A magnificent one, sure, but still a horse. I tried to brush away the thoughts, but they lingered. The more I fought them, the more they returned, like an itch I couldn't scratch. The days that followed were a blur of mixed emotions. I tried to focus on other things, reading, gardening, even baking, but I kept finding myself back in the stable, lingering longer and longer. I knew it was strange, knew that these feelings weren't what I should be feeling for a horse. But the connection was undeniable. He was there, comforting me when I needed it the most. Richard's calls had grown shorter, more distracted, and I found myself looking forward to my time with Midnight more than anything else. One late afternoon, I received a call from Richard. He sounded rushed, as if calling me was an obligation rather than a desire. "Hey Jess, just wanted to let you know I might extend my trip by a few days. It's an important deal." I tried to respond cheerfully, but my heart sank. "Of course, Richard." "I understand," I said, my voice betraying nothing of the loneliness that threatened to drown me. That night, I walked out to the stable under a sky full of stars. Midnight greeted me with a soft nicker, and I hugged him. Tears flowed down my cheeks as I whispered into his neck, "You're all I have right now." He nudged me gently, and I stayed there, wrapped in the quiet solace of his presence. The following days became increasingly strange. Midnight became more than just an animal to me. He was my confidant, my friend, my comfort. I found myself spending hours with him, and it became clear that I was blurring the lines between the love for a pet and the need for companionship. One evening, everything changed. Richard returned home earlier than expected. I didn't hear his car pull into the driveway. I was in the stable, as I often was, brushing Midnight's mane, whispering to him, lost in my own thoughts. "Jessica?" I heard Richard's voice, sharp and unexpected. I spun around, startled, my hand still resting on Midnight's neck. Richard was standing there, his eyes shifting between me and the horse, a look of confusion etched on his face. "What's going on?" His voice was laced with suspicion. My heart pounded, and I struggled to find words. How could I explain the attachment I had formed without sounding absurd? I could see the questions in his eyes, questions that I didn't have answers to. I was just spending time with Midnight, I stammered, knowing it wasn't enough. Richard stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "You're always here, Jess. Every time I call, you're in the stable. It's like you've replaced me with him." "That's not true," I protested, though my voice lacked conviction. "It's just, you've been gone a lot, Richard. Midnight has been here when you weren't." Richard shook his head. "He's a horse, Jessica. He's not a person. I don't understand what's going on here." I swallowed hard, tears welling up in my eyes. I know it sounds crazy. I was lonely and Midnight was here. He listened when I had no one else to talk to. Richard's face softened for a moment, the anger replaced by something else, hurt. "Are you saying you had an emotional affair with a horse?" The words hung in the air, absurd and yet painfully real. I shook my head, tears spilling over. "No, not like that. I needed someone, Richard. I needed you, and when you weren't there, I turned to Midnight. I know it's not right, but it's the truth." Richard turned away, pacing the small stable, his hands running through his hair. "This is insane, Jessica. I don't even know how to process this." "Please, Richard," I pleaded, stepping towards him. "I love you. I want to fix this. I got lost in my loneliness." He stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. "Why didn't you tell me you felt this way?" I hesitated. "I tried, but every time I brought it up, you were too busy, too tired. Eventually, I stopped trying. I didn't want to be a burden." Richard's shoulders slumped, and he let out a long sigh. "I didn't know, Jess. I thought we were okay. I thought you understood that I was doing all of this for us." "I did understand," I said, my voice trembling. But understanding didn't make the loneliness go away. Midnight was there for me when I felt like I had no one else. Richard's eyes softened, and he stepped closer, taking my hand. "I'm here now, and I want to fix this, but it's going to take time." I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The days that followed were tense, filled with difficult conversations and moments of silence. Richard and I had a lot to work through, not just my emotional attachment to Midnight, but the underlying issues that had driven us apart in the first place. We started therapy, both individually and as a couple, hoping to rebuild the trust that had been broken. Midnight was still a part of my life, but I made a conscious effort to set boundaries. I still cared for him, still found comfort in his presence, but I no longer used him as a substitute for the emotional connection I craved from my husband. Richard, too, made changes. He cut back on his travel, made more time for us, and slowly, we began to find our way back to each other. There were setbacks, of course, moments when the pain and betrayal resurfaced, when Richard would look at me and I could see the doubt in his eyes. But we were both committed to making it work, to healing the wounds that had nearly torn us apart. I am glad you listened to this memory of mine. I hope it made you feel different emotions. I am learning not to be overcome by my excitement. and I am thinking of sharing it with you again. Thank you for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for more videos.